This is your basic type of summarization and outlining. And this is also the bare minimum that you can get away with for any sort of live event, any sort of live content. And I said before, well, yeah, you can do a brain dump later into your phone, but especially for anything that's live, anything that has a conversational component, you have a conversation with somebody over Skype or telephone, or anything like that where it's live and there's no recording, you need to be summarizing that and outlining it as it's happening. And this is an area where being able to type fast is one of the biggest advantages, because you just can't write fast enough to keep up with some people. And the other thing is that in terms of formatting, if you don't know those keyboard shortcuts and you don't know the how to format things so that you can keep things formatted and still go quickly, then that's going to be another problem. Another thing is that most speakers are not going to present things to you in a highly formatted way. So they're going to be talking, they're going to go off on tangents, they're going to have ideas, they're going to go into a story and then come back out and then go back in again. And so it's very hard to know ahead of time how to structure that and how to format it all. So what's going to happen is you're going to get a set of notes that's pretty unstructured, and at most is probably going to have one or maybe two levels of hierarchy. But for anything that's happening live and when most of the information you're taking in is new, then it's going to be very hard to create a hierarchy or a structure. If you're in a conversation with somebody and maybe half of what they're saying is new and half of it isn't, that's a situation where it's going to be a little bit easier to structure it. But especially if it's a live conversation where there's no way for you to take notes, or maybe you have to go into your phone, that's another thing that I do. If I'm ever at a networking or just having conversation with conference, seminar, whatever, and I want to take a note on what somebody's saying, I'm going to either pull out my Moleskine or I'll take out my phone and I'll say, hey, I want to write that down. Because a lot of people, it's kind of crazy to me, but it's pretty common for people to just take out their phone and start texting or check an email while you're talking to them. So I always go ahead and say preemptively, I want to take a note because that's really interesting what you just said, so that they don't think, oh, I'm texting, or oh, I'm doing something else. And then I'll even say again, if I keep the phone out, oh, I'm going to write that down, or kind of mumble it, because people really they don't like it when they feel like, oh, you're texting, you're doing something else while they're talking. So it's important, if you take your phone out, people are going to be thinking about that. And so you should preemptively tell them, well, I'm just taking notes in my phone, and whatever you're saying is really interesting. Another thing is, if you're interested more in the structure of conversations, how they work, part of the reason why we're so bad at remembering conversations and live presentations is because they're not structured in the same way as things that are written. And we're used to learning things through written, or through getting a worksheet or getting a reading to do in class, and then taking notes where there's a structure to it and the teacher's intentionally structuring everything for us, and then we know how to put it all together. But in terms of having to memorize something that's a live conversation, it's very difficult to do, even if you know mnemonics. And the biggest advantage you can have in doing that is to understand the structure of conversation and how conversations really work. And I have a course that's not out yet on that, but it's coming out pretty soon. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, conversation, this is a very, very interesting course. It talks about stuff that isn't out there anywhere else. So definitely check that out in the next few weeks or month. For most of you, by the time you're hearing this, it'll probably be out there. In terms of processing, now we're getting from low to medium levels of processing. So as you know, it takes time for things to congeal. It takes time for those processes to happen, for that neural network to form and congeal. So it's okay to go back and check on that stuff later. But what you want to do is avoid going back to the original content if you can. And with something that's live, there is no way to go back. So that's why it's important to capture as much as possible. That's why it's so important to be able to type quickly and type without having to look at your keyboard. So I'll bring a little computer, my little netbook, anytime I go to a seminar or conference, and I'll just be typing almost the entire time, because I want to capture all those ideas. And I'm not just capturing what they're saying, I'm also capturing things that I notice about, well, how is the audience responding to this or to that, or what techniques are they using to teach this, or what techniques are they using to talk about this or that, or something I notice about their story, or something it reminded me of something else, or some other thing that I want to take action on. And that's where having that punctuation system also helps, because then later you can search through that document and find that those little pieces of punctuation, because it's just you just put a dash and then you put the letter, and then you search for the dash plus the letter and you'll find it, and it'll exclude everything else. So that's a really good way to use punctuation, then get back to what you're looking for later. But this is and there's two methods. There's the analog method, and then there's the digital method, meaning writing things out by hand on paper or typing things in. So there's certain advantages to the analog. You can transfer it in later. You can read it out loud and then put that into and just record that into the computer, or even record into your phone and send that to Dragon later. It also helps you avoid screen time. And there's also situations where you're just not allowed to have a computer there, or it would be very weird to have a conversation with your computer out while you're talking to a person, and even have your phone out. So that's a situation where you're going to use just pen and paper. And another way this gets into the situation of, well, how do you write faster? That's a whole separate subject, but one interesting and easy way to write faster is to just exclude vowels, and vowels make up about 1/3 to 1/2 of all words. And so if you just exclude the vowels, because basically it's just consonant, vowel, consonant most of the time, and so if you just exclude the vowels, you eliminate a large chunk of what you're writing down, and your brain can interpret it without the vowels. So that's a way to and also just coming up with shorthand is a way to write a lot faster. There's even people that were professional transcriptionists decades and centuries ago. They invented their own languages in shorthand in order to be able to write about as fast as somebody could speak, which is a major challenge. And same thing is true with people that transcribe with keyboards. Is with a QWERTY keyboard, it's pretty difficult to get above 100 words per minute, because the QWERTY keyboard was intentionally created to slow typists down, because at the time, if you typed faster than a certain speed, the typewriter would jam. So they created it intentionally to be slow. And so if you're looking for a way to improve that, check out the Dvorak or the Colmac keyboard layouts, and you just switch the keyboard layout and you get a big speed improvement. The only thing to consider with these speed improvements is that how much are you actually typing per day, and is the bottleneck how fast you can type, or is the bottleneck how fast you can think? So most of you are probably not thinking at 200 words per minute or even 100 words per minute, and I'm not either for most of the time, because when you're thinking that quickly, it's mostly outputting information that you're already extremely familiar with. So anytime you're thinking about new things, it's going to take you time to synthesize, and you don't need to be typing that quickly. And the amount of situations where you're in where you actually need to be typing that fast are pretty slim. So for the most part, even though Dvorak and Colback are faster, unless you have a job where you're typing a lot and you need to have that sort of speed, then it's probably not worth learning. But if you don't know how to touch type yet, or if you just want to take it on as a challenge, then go for it. And it's the kind of skill that you can pick up in about a month. The other thing is you can also just switch to Dragon. So you can switch to verbally inputting stuff, and then you're going to easily be able to go above 100 words per minute, and the computer will be able to turn that into text. The challenge there is that it turns out that your brain uses different grooves to come up with what you say versus what you write, and you actually have a different voice that you use when you write versus when you speak. And it turns out I actually have a course coming out on that also, called Cold Emailing, and the course is about how do you write emails that sound conversational. And the reason why that's valuable is because when you're reaching out to people, they're much more likely to respond if it seems casual and it seems friendly, as opposed to something that's super formal, which is how we're taught to write in school, and it can be a major hindrance to communicating effectively with people. So it's really important to know how to do that. So analog, it's going to be 2 to 4 times slower. You're talking about 20 words per minute, whereas if you know how to touch type, you're probably at about 50 words per minute. If you don't know and you're hunting pecking, you're probably looking at 15, 20, 25 words per minute. And when you're typing at that speed, it's not that pleasant to write things out and type things out while you're hearing somebody talk. So it makes sense to maybe use analog. And it's also good for drawing. And you can scan these drawings in. So one thing that happened to me a few months ago is I got a pack of 6 Moleskine notebooks, which I use one per month, and they were all blank, and I intended to get them all lined. And so what I decided is I'm not going to return these. I'm just going to keep them, and I'm going to decide for the next 6 months I'm going to try to draw as much as possible and use drawing instead to represent ideas instead of any other method, if at all possible. And that's improved my learning in a lot of different areas. So it turned out to be a blessing in disguise. So always think about how you can use other methods, especially drawing and pictures, because especially for things like frameworks and models, a picture is really worth 1,000 words. Your brain is very good at storing pictures, and it's good at combining and comparing pictures instead of abstract words. So anytime you can get it, and then also the metaphors, when you use an image, your brain is much more suited to finding metaphorical connections through images than through words. So when you're looking at the sound of a word or hearing the sound of a word, there's very few words that sound exactly the same or even close, and those connections usually aren't relevant to you. Whereas pictures that don't even look that similar but look somewhat similar in some way or another, those images are going to connect in your head, and that's where innovation happens. And that can even happen when you're having dreams or other things. So really valuable to turn things into pictures, and that's a habit that you should explore and build upon. And it's not just something of, oh, I want things to look pretty, but it's actually about converting things into a format in your brain that is most usable for your brain. So there's formats externally, either digital typing or drawing things out or writing out by hand, but ultimately it's about pictures. And our language, both written down on a piece of paper and typed into a computer, originates from pictures that were just standardized, and eventually they morphed into the letters and numbers. And if you're looking at like a language like Chinese, into those characters, they morphed from originally being actual pictures. So that's where all of these symbols come from in the first place, and that's how we're wired to think. So when you can convert stuff into images, you're going to get big gains. It's not always going to be immediate, but innovation is never immediate. Innovation comes when you give yourself enough good ideas, you build enough connections between them, and you start creating new mixtures and new combinations that nobody else has ever done before. So if you're interested in that sort of stuff, check out my Creative Genius course.